Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. Thank you for joining us as we start our special subsegment focusing on the Mandalorian. And specifically, we'll call this the Manda-Law-Rian because it's a pinata of legal issues. This show completes me as a person, and I'm just ecstatic to have live action Star Wars weekly for over a month. With me tonight is Gabby Martin and Thomas Harper. Gabby, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. It's definitely great to have Star Wars on a weekly or almost weekly basis until Rise of Skywalker.
And then we go to the movies.
Yeah.
And Thomas, how you doing?
Well, Josh, you told me that you could bring me onto this podcast warm or you could bring me onto this podcast cold. So I chose the voluntary method, and I'm just excited to be alive and not frozen in carbonite on your ship here.
I have spoken. Yeah, it's so much fun. There were some articles going around with saying like Bob Iger was like putting Star Wars on hiatus after Rise of Skywalker. And the only thing I got to say to that is balderdash. We have The Mandalorian, we got Cassian Andor coming out, we have Kenobi coming out, we have the return of the Clone Wars. I'm sure there'll be another animated series after Resistance. So I don't see the brakes being really pumped on Star Wars. I think getting it on Disney Plus will allow us to have deeper analysis and more thoughtful episodes to explore, which is part of the reason why Star Trek was so successful over 50 years, because you can do more with TV. And when you have a big movie, you get a big event. So I'm just ecstatic. How do you two feel?
Gabby, go ahead, take it.
Yeah, I mean, it's to think that Disney would even for a hot second consider putting any sort of breaks or slowdowns or barriers to either Marvel or Star Wars seems like the dumbest idea to even fathom. I mean, those are their biggest cash inflow right now, besides, the general Disney properties. So that would be like telling them, oh, Disney, we don't want to make money right now. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is abundantly clear, and has been since they took this over, that the money making is a huge part of it, obviously, but this is a franchise that they care to grow and develop. Obviously, that has a financial tie to it, but consistently, you can put whatever spin you want on it about, whether it's turmoil or whatnot, but I choose to see the change in directors, the selection of who's in charge of these projects and whatnot, as an investment and an overwhelming desire to have folks that know and love Star Wars and really know the story and want to tell great extensions of that existing story in charge of everything that they're developing. That's why you have folks like Favreau and Filoni in on this project. That's why you have Filoni coming back to finish out the Clone Wars. I mean, that show alone, the Clone Wars, how many studios would give the ability to close out a show that they themselves canceled or had a hand in canceling when they took over the property? Again and again, they've shown a real genuine care for this property, and it doesn't always align with every single fan's view of what they think Star Wars is, but it doesn't belong to any of us. And so long as they keep putting that care and that love into the stories that they're telling, I'm okay if I don't like a story or two. But fortunately, The Mandalorian does not fall into that category.
No. As someone who saw the original film in a drive-in when I was very, very young, it touched all the right buttons, because whether it was looking through a telescope at the Blurrgs, which again looked like Luke on Tatooine, it just checked all the boxes that feels like Star Wars. And we don't have Jedi or the Force. It's a completely different element, but completely the same. And that's just beautiful. And this one episode, I think, has more legal issues than all of Solo did, and that's hard to pull off.
Yeah.
So why don't we start exploring some of these issues, and we'll get into bounty hunting. Thomas, could you illuminate us on just a brief history of bounty hunting?
Yeah, I think bounty hunting is one of those, and Star Wars sort of perpetuates I think the myth that bounty hunting as a whole has in real life society. I mean, if you've seen movies like Django Unchained, or just the TV show like Dog the Bounty Hunter, your view of bounty hunting is this, like, maybe not with Dog the Bounty Hunter so much, but this kind of glorified, like, gunslinging type of life where you're just out killing or capturing. And while that may have been the case, at one point in history, certainly the industry nowadays is very heavily regulated, and we're going to get into some of those laws. But you have to go back to the late 1600s in England for really the start, because that's late 1600s, about 1679 or so. England passed the Habeas Act. Basically, that act allowed prisoners to be released on bond, or what we today know as bond, before their trials. Before that, you were just in prison up until you stood trial. And just as is the case today, and has been the case ever since anybody, like any single prisoner, was allowed out on any type of bond, people will jump bail, right? They will run, they will try to not show up for their court date, and you need some mechanism to try to bring those folks back into the system. And that's where bounty hunters, or bail runners, whatever you want to call them, because there's about 100 different names that they go by these days, came into the picture. In the 1800s in the United States, they really kind of came into vogue. There's a Supreme Court case that we'll talk about that is often misrepresented as far as its significance for bounty hunting. In fact, if you go on a lot of like bounty hunting company websites, I think you can get that Supreme Court case like printed on a flag, like to wave it around. But you had companies like the Pinkertons, who are famous in pop culture and whatnot, coined the phrase the private eye. These companies that are out making money off of bringing fugitives back. And then we leap into the 20th century, and you start seeing all across the United States, states start to reel in bounty hunters as a whole. That the profession is tightly regulated, and the laws are different depending on which state you're in.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I pulled up some of the code sections across different states, and in California, where we call them bondsmen, and it says a bail bondsman taking an abscondent defendant into custody under authority of Penal Code Section 1301 is acting as a private citizen for the purpose of the application of the exclusionary rule, which purpose, as commonly expressed, is that of deterring official police excess in the conduct of search and seizure. That's a little disturbing when you think about it, but it makes sense that they're not acting as like official state agents. Okay. Tennessee defines bounty hunting, and they still use the term bounty hunting, means a person who acts as an agent of a professional bondsman who attempts to or takes into custody a person who has failed to appear in court and whose bond has been forfeited for a fee, the payment of which is contingent upon the taking of a person into custody and returning the person to custody of the professional bondsman for whom the bounty hunter works. That is a mouthful.
I have to say, of course, Tennessee still calls them bounty hunters, and I presume they all dress like the Mandalorian there, maybe with a jug of moonshine in hand or something. I don't know.
If they don't now, I'm sure they soon will, because hey, look at us, we're cool. Now, this little hat tip goes to Brian Young from Full of Sith, a lovely human being. He asked the question like, hey, can bounty hunters kill people? And it's like, hey, that's a fantastic question, because we see that really early in the first episode.
Like immediately.
Yeah, it's like, I didn't break out the stopwatch, but in less than a minute, we have a blue individual individual being threatened about having his glands cut out because he would have sweet musk. And that sounds all bad. And that turns out that that guy's the bail jumper. And the two people who were threatening them, that individual, the Mandalorian takes out. Now, facts matter. The Mandalorian's just standing at the bar, not speaking. The assailant, who was not speaking English, asks about the steel on the Mandalorian's armor and runs a knife across the Mandalorian's chest, across his armor. And that's when the can of whoop ass is open on those two assailants, including, this is the complicated one, where the individual with the tentacle mouth, who I think that species appeared in Rogue One, but okay, good. I wasn't hallucinating. Makes a break for it. Trips. The Mandalorian uses fires a cable weapon to pull the assailant back in, to which a blaster is drawn. The Mandalorian then shoots the door so it closes and cuts the person in two. So they be dead unless their anatomy allows them to like grow a body part back, like the lower half. It's Star Wars, who knows?
Side issue, if I'm defending him there, I say that is a malfunction of that cantina's equipment, their door. That was not his fault that it chopped him in half. He could not have foreseen that sort of thing.
I mean, but he's perfectly like centered in that door. So he could be using the door as a weapon, not necessarily not knowing what it was, that it was a malfunction. That seemed a bit too perfect.
So before we get into the issue of defense of others and self-defense, let's address the bounty hunters can kill. And Gabby, can you share your research on this point?
Yeah, so so we're talking about can they kill? And they are, I mean, what Thomas was talking about earlier is, the Supreme Court case, which is Taylor versus Tainter from 1872, a lot of people use it as this kind of authority, that there's this federal authority that says bounty hunters can do whatever they want. And that's really not true, because what that case, where that language comes from is in dicta, which may be persuasive, but it's not by any means, binding, or has no binding value on any court, much less any kind of federal charges. And in general, the bounty hunters are required to contact local police and work with local police. They can't just kind of like cowboy through, the state or county or city or town or whatever, doing all that they can to, obtain these bail jumpers. So that's why I kind of think with the Mandalorian, we may be in kind of some gray area of a violent independent contractor, as opposed to an official bounty hunter in the way that we recognize that term, however outdated it may be, in the United States, because he does seem to have the authority, when he tells the blue individual, I could bring you in cold, or I can bring you in hot. And then there's we see later in the episode that bounty hunters are given orders to kill, which would totally not be the case in the United States. A bounty hunter is required to detain an individual who has skipped bail, and have licenses and be regulated and all that kind of stuff. They're not, obligated to, they have no authority to go shoot somebody the way cops would. They don't have the same kind of, use of force regulations and rules that police would have.
But here you see the line get blurred, because, and this becomes very convenient for somebody in his line of work, because when he goes into this bar, he is not there accidentally, right? He's after that Mithril, that bounty. Now, it wasn't clear whether it sounds like his species name. I don't know if he actually has a specific name, but that's why he's there, right? And he's and that mithril is under the custody of those other two roughnecks or three roughnecks. He doesn't go right in and shoot them and start a fight to take that bounty from under their nose, nor does he go in and shoot their bounty. He goes to the bar and waits for them to start a fight and then defends himself. And even with that poor Quarren that gets chopped in half in the door, right before he hauls him into the doorway and allows him to get chopped in half, he takes a blaster bolt to the chest armor. That was a shot intended to kill him, right? So, you very quickly bleed into self-defense law, and all of a sudden he can very conveniently defend himself. And that wasn't the case certainly with the mithril. He didn't have any reason to defend himself and kill the mithril, but you could easily envision a scenario where that bounty fights back, and then all of a sudden, you've got a valid right to defend yourself, and that bounty is suddenly cold instead of warm.
Yeah. But I think you're definitely in the realm of private citizen laws as opposed to kind of any law enforcement laws or regulations.
Yeah, I mean, every state is different in terms of their licensure requirements and whatnot. Even in a heavily regulated state like North Carolina, where I'm from, the regulation is done by the Commissioner of Insurance. So this is not some law enforcement supervised entity. It's an arm of that industry. To get a license as a bail bond runner, as they're called in the state, you have to take a 2-day course, which amounts to probably 16 hours of coursework, maybe less if you're taking lunch. And you have to be 21 years old, and you have to have a clean criminal record and can't be law enforcement. So the bar is not very high, and they do have quite a bit of authority. They've got the authority to go out and make arrests and whatnot, but there is that line there. I don't think there's any state in the country, short of self-defense, maybe in Florida, I don't know. You can't just go smoke your target.
Yeah, there's a few things to break down. So, the Taylor case, 1872, that's, in the cowboy decade. So it makes sense for people to romanticize bounty hunters being that cowboy-esque story to go out and bring in a bail jumper. Going to the meeting that the Mandalorian has with Griff. I do love Star Wars names. He does, reference 3 or 4 bail jumpers and one wanted smuggler. Bail jumpers means that there's some adjudication going on. And while the Empire's fallen and we don't quite have the New Republic yet, or if it is, it's not, I don't know how functional it is at this point in the galaxy's history, but it means that there are some planets with legal systems where people are jumping bail. So there is some due process taking place. And the idea of an intergalactic bounty hunter guild that would have agreements with different interplanetary jurisdictions is kind of fascinating to think about. And the fact that things are in such a economic upturn, possibly an intergalactic depression or recession after the fall of the empire, that the economy's beat to hell, which is why people can't afford guild rates. Because if governments are having that problem, that raises some interesting questions about, is this like post-World War I with a interplanetary recession, or is this something else? I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because according to Favreau, we're 7 years post Return of the Jedi for this series. And while conceivably, so the Galactic Concordance, the peace accord that ended the Civil War, was signed a little bit after the Battle of Jakku, which was about a year after Return of the Jedi, you're still only talking 5 to 6 years of New Republic rule. It's very clear from the context in this show that while we don't to my knowledge, we don't know the exact planet names of all these planets that the folks are on. It's not very close to the center of the galaxy. I mean, you've still got Imperial remnants who would have been swept out of the core worlds by this point, that have hold there. There's clearly no New Republic presence that we can easily see. The currency, Josh, as you mentioned, I mean, it's a mix of, you see Grief Karga, he's got Imperial credits, he's got Mon Cal Flan, which is an awesome currency, by the way. You've got the client, Werner Herzog's character, paying with Beskar steel. I mean, it's just a total mess. There is no economy out there. And so it is completely conceivable that individual systems or collectives of systems could have maybe a patchwork of laws, or you could have criminal organizations that have sort of their own patchwork of something like that to fill the void.
Exactly. It is fascinating. And the flan did look sticky. That looked
Jiggled.
like really weird aquatic currency. So it's like, do you put that in your pocket, or do you have a baggie for it? Like, how's that work?
I would have loved to have been in the room when the sound designer and the prop designers are talking about, like, what does Mon Cal currency sound like? Like, what does it feel like? Because they feel like they nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just, we can nerd out on the show after we get through the law, but yeah, there's so much there. Let's get into the issue of, do bounty hunters have uniforms? And Gabby, I think you talked a little bit about this, but do you want to expound upon it?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting, how, and we've talked about this in other Star Wars discussions, of how do you identify somebody, and especially, when the galaxy is in disarray, how do you identify somebody, especially how you would identify a bounty hunter. So in 9 states, laws address how bounty hunters or fugitive recovery agents can represent themselves. In Iowa, recovery agents can only wear a uniform within specifications given by the Commissioner of Public Safety, and cannot wear a uniform or make any statement that gives the impression they are a member of law enforcement. So again, making it very clear that they are private citizens, kind of doing these citizens, kind of a grand citizen arrest type thing. So what I was thinking is, does the guild have something similar in that they have to identify themselves as guild members? I mean, we see that later, that there's a discussion between the Mandalorian and IG-11 of him being a guild member. But do the Mandalorians themselves kind of have a uniform of a bounty hunter, with the history of Boba Fett and the legends and history of that? Does that, their armor and uniform, in a sense, become its own kind of signal that this person's a bounty hunter?
In some states, they won't have a uniform requirement, but they will have, you can get a badge to identify yourself. Mm-hmm. And Gabby makes a good point that across all states, you're going to see really, really strict laws that prevent bounty hunters from representing that they have any connection to law enforcement. And most states have restrictions against, most if not all states have restrictions against anybody connected to law enforcement being a bounty hunter or a bail agent, anything like that. It may be, and Josh, I think we're going to talk about this in a bit, but IG-11 references this bondsman guild protocol. It's my favorite scene probably in any Star Wars movie now, where he's just walking in and quotes this law. But perhaps, maybe we'll hear more about it, but perhaps this is the regulating document for guild members, and maybe they have, we don't see it from either of them, but and in fact, when IG-11 asks him about being a guild member, all the Mandalorian does is hold out the tracking fob to identify himself. So perhaps that's an identifying feature that only a guild member is going to have access to that technology.
Yeah, it was like they were purposely teasing us. And, that with IG-11 quoting subparagraph 16 of the Bondsman's Guild protocol waiver, and that he had filed a writ of, let's see, no, there was a, he
Seizure.
actually, yeah, a writ of seizure, claiming like, yeah, this bounty is mine. It's like, oh, so they're quoting stuff. Is somebody going to write that? And if they haven't written it yet, we'd be happy to help. Favreau, if you're listening, call us. Happy to help you put one of those bad boys together. The entire issue of, like, what can a bounty hunter do? There is a Connecticut case, that dealt with an issue of the plaintiff claiming that the bounty hunter was entitled to use deadly force in apprehending a fleeing felon, and therefore could fire a warning shot. And the court said, like, there's no statute or case law that supports the right of a bail enforcement agent to kill fleeing felons. And a bounty hunter's legal right to seize and hold does not automatically authorize the use of force. And in that case, we're like, yeah, you can't do that. So with us, we have a very Wild West, situation that, of course, there's going to be a shootout. We're in Star Wars. And it would be boring if there wasn't, this high risk, post-Civil War period of action taking place and weapons being drawn and shootouts happening. But if we start seeing normal bounties, I mean, technically we might have seen, I guess, one with the first one that, the first suspect was apprehended, no use of force against him, and then frozen in carbonite, and that's a separate issue entirely. But there's like no warning shot at the guy. It's, he's presented the puck that shows the warrant for him, and he's brought into custody. So on that level, it kind of seems by the book, except there's holograms.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you've got to have some system where his authority to make that arrest is recognized planet to planet, because it does not seem like at all that from one planet to another, they have their own little individual set of laws that he has to abide by. Like if you're a bail agent or bounty hunter in Tennessee and you cross over the border into North Carolina, your authority ends unless you have a license in that next state. And that's going to be the case wherever you go. That's not going to really be practical for somebody like the Mandalorian, who's obviously trying to travel around different parts of the galaxy. So I like the idea that it's this connected system where he can go where he needs to go.
Let's talk contract law and performance. And are the pucks issued by Grief, are those contracts? Are they unilateral contracts for the bounty hunters to carry out? Or are they something else? Is it breach if the bounty hunter isn't able to apprehend the suspect? And Gabby, would you like to start and share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you just with all that vocabulary, you just brought a lot of first-year contracts back. So thank you for the throwback. But I think
sorry for the flashbacks.
So I think the unilateral contract, I would say probably not, because it seems from the interaction that we saw with the Mandalorian and Grief that Grief is controlling which fobs and which pucks are given to which guild members. So he seems to have, it's not like they're put up, kind of like the Old West posters that say, wanted, however much money is the reward for turning this person in. That would be, I think, more of a unilateral contract, whereas this seems to be, giving the puck and giving the fob seems to be a promise to, if you bring in X, I will pay you Y. Although some confusion lies in the promise of payment, because it seems that the promise of payment was changed from the time that the Mandalorian originally got the pucks to the time he brought them in, because he seems to be kind of pissed when, you know, all he gets are these imperial credits, and he says, you know, this barely covers gas, so or covers fuel. So, you know, there seems to be an issue there, as far as the payment method changing, and that may be a breach of the terms of the agreement. But we'd have to see kind of from the beginning, you know, what was agreed upon and what was kind of their original discussion with those, what were they, 5 bounties that he brought in?
Yeah, 4 or 5.
4 or 5.
And
And that,
I mean, it's a couple things that, you know, is there terms and conditions saying like we can change the rate because there's a recession and people aren't able to pay the full amount. Grief is also, you know, has the unfortunate role of management with trying to keep everybody employed so they can keep working. It's like, I can't give all of these to you. Others need to work. And like, it's like, okay, you're kind of in dad mode now of being in, you know, ensuring that everyone in the guild doesn't go broke because there might be a surplus of work, but a shortage of cash for paying clients. So I found that very entertaining. You know, Thomas, your thoughts?
I think the puck is like this excellent visual and tangible thing that represents the contract that the two have. You know, it's not to say that an oral contract between Grief and the Mandalorian couldn't be enforced, because it could, but it puts the Mandalorian having that physical puck in a better position, obviously, to say, no, this is, you hired me. This is representative of the meeting of the minds that we had, the exchange that we had. Interestingly, with that payoff, the whole argument is that, and Josh and Gabby both kind of touched on this, but he's given the correct amount in like numerically, right? It's just not in a payment form that's really worth anything. And it's like being paid in Confederate dollars in 1866. You know, and he sort of scoffs at this. And like this is going to be like a really nerdy contractual part, but his consideration was a certain credit amount, right? A certain amount. The amount that he's now been given is not worth that based on the fall of the empire, which makes me sort of wonder whether the terms that they worked out specified the form of currency to be paid. That's not really an issue in the United States, because it's not like you walk into a contract expecting to be surprised with like, you know, a franc or a pound when you get paid. But it's an issue here, right? Because the galaxy's sort of in turmoil, and he has to make sort of a quick judgment call. Is it worth it to legally fight this out and have to prove up that Imperial credits aren't worth what he contracted for, or can he just kind of cut his losses, take a settlement, which is exactly what he does in the Mon-Cal currency.
Yeah, it's not like he was given gold bars that were stamped CSA. Like that's like gold, still gold. So you could make that work. What he got was like, you know, money technically is an imaginary construct because we give it value. He was given something that was given value because it was imperial, and the empire's been gone for, you know, a decade. And
he pulled a Watto on Grief.
Yeah, it's just like, I want to get paid in something tangible, and that's what the client does. But we'll talk more about that.
And I think you could theoretically kind of plan out a situation in where something like this would happen. If you had something like an international contract, you would want to specify the mode. If you know, if it's a sale contract, you're gonna want, if you're the seller, you're gonna want to specify the unit of currency that you're getting paid in, because you know, $1,000 is different from 1,000 pounds versus 1,000 euros, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you just say, you know, $1,000 or, you know, cash or whatever, that could be anything. So I think, you know, in a situation like that, but I think who the burden would be on to specify that unit would kind of be interesting to think about.
Yeah. Think about it on a basic level. If you've ever seen a contract, whether a lot of leases have this, but certainly if you've ever looked at buying a home, agreements of sale for homes or certainly for land purchases, it's going to specify dollars, right? It's going to specify an amount, but the fact that it says dollars, that's talking about a US dollar bill, right? So it's talking about our currency. And it's going to further specify the type of sort of bank transaction, right? It's got to be immediately available funds. We're not taking credit on this. I mean, there's some real technical language in there that makes sure that when this transaction closes, you get the money that you're looking at in the amount that you want, and you're getting it now when you close. And so obviously that's important. But I love that like quick transaction with him is like a great example of a legal settlement there, because he's like, oh, we'll just cut our losses and take a deal. It's not worth fighting this out with the guy who feeds me jobs.
Yeah, it's pick your battles, and that's not one to fight. But it does raise interesting issues of like, okay, should we be on the coaxium standard? Like, what's the
what's your
it's like what's the basis that gives the money value? Like, is it just are you on some pick the natural resource, whether it's kyber crystals as a basis of an economy, or some fuel or something that has value, because if not, it's like, what backs up the currency? And that just brings back all kinds of lessons from the 1970s and Nixon taking us off the gold standard. But that's another discussion. Gabby, I believe you raised the issue, and if you didn't, please say so, whether or not if fobs infringe on privacy rights. And could you share your theory?
Yeah. So what I was thinking was, we kind of interpreted the puck as the warrant, right? The warrant that says this person is, has skipped bail, they need to be dragged back, and that's kind of the governing document. Whereas the fob seems to be, it seems to be part and parcel in the conversation with grief of the puck. But when the Mandalorian goes to Werner Herzog's character, and he just kind of gives him the fob without a puck, and he says, we have his last known location, and there seems to be no, the person that they're looking for isn't a bail jumper, isn't somebody who's kind of violated any sort of laws. He's just somebody that the Mandalorian is being hired to find. And I think what's interesting is, does that fob that seemingly tracks their location, as we see from the opening shots of the Mandalorian, does the bail jumper or whoever is being tracked by that fob or know that they are being tracked? And do they give up their right to privacy when they commit the crime? Is it something that they're knowingly kind of giving up, that's saying, okay, yes, I am a criminal now, I know I am being tracked, kind of like an ankle monitor? Or is it something that they have no idea, and that's why they're surprised when a bounty hunter kind of says, oh, time to take you in? So it's just a very kind of, it was very freaky, especially the second instance of where we learn that the fob can just track any random person.
Yeah, and how's it tracking? There was a Supreme Court case in the last decade, and it was one of the fun ones where the dissent was all the liberals and Scalia, and where it was doing DNA swabs for people who were arrested, and then that raised privacy concerns, and it was Scalia writing the dissent that, again, the liberals joined, which is, again, well, just one of those fun opinions, like, this shouldn't occur in nature, but it did. and Scalia go like, this is scary, terrifying.
Yeah.
Well, where are they getting the DNA? Like, and it makes sense if somebody was arrested, if they're able to somehow sniff their DNA with the fob, or is it some other technology that they're using? And for, the ultimate mark that they're going after, how they get that DNA, if that's what they were using.
Yeah.
And also, what was the 8-digit code? Like, is that like a social security number? Like, what
chain
is
code.
that? Yeah.
And that's a really good question, because that's clearly something that's important to his work in finding these people, because he asks the client for the target's chain code, and all they can give him, it sounds like your age is part of your chain code. So is it some sort of, Gabby, this goes to your point, is it like a biological chip that folks have? I mean, we'll get into who this target is in a little bit, but it would be strange for a little baby to have some sort of implant or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to be something of an amalgamation of both like a biological chip that, kind of gathers data on their age, and also, like Josh, like you were saying, a social security number, because your social security number is something you would have from the time you were born. And so, but it just seems like this very kind of specific thing that is not exclusive to bail jumpers or those who are being kind of, in violation of some law. It seems to be inherent to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And, do they know they're being monitored? That's that's the real question. Do they know?
And we haven't seen that in Star Wars before. So like, this is a new thing for tracking people.
Mm-hmm.
And just on a civil liberty perspective, that's terrifying that you could just magically be tracked. Huge privacy issues. And again, we haven't seen it before. So don't know what that means, and don't know if they'll explain how the underlying technology, because Star Wars is one of those series where they don't always explain things. And you know what? That's okay. I can live with that. For us, from a legal perspective, it's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Like, how are they being able to track people?
Let us hope that there's a galactic civil liberties union that is taking care of this.
And if not, we could form
Risen
one
from
that
the ash.
that could be our cameo. So that's
Hey, you haven't seen us in a while the Galactic Empire has been around, but we're back.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, you didn't kill all of us, and we're here.
They let us out of exile.
We're back. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Palpatine put hits on all the lawyers, but that's just getting Shakespearean, not something Jesus said. But I digress. Let's talk about something less civil rights related, but still very interesting, and that's self-driving speeders. Because the first speeder that comes up, has an R2 unit apparently built into it. So, the head's on the hood and the body is the body of the car, or speeder, forgive me, and raises wonderful issues about self-driving cars across the country. Because in California, we have California Vehicle Code Section 38750, which required the DMV to adopt regulations governing both the testing and public use of autonomous vehicles on California roadways. And there are 3 types of permits that can be issued for autonomous vehicles. And that's a testing permit, which the vehicle requires a driver, a driverless testing permit, a deployment public use permit, and each has different requirements. This one effective on April 2nd, 2018 in parts of Mountain View and Los Altos, California. You can see driving cars going around in the testing phases, and that's actually very interesting. But seeing that taxi Uber combo come floating in for hailing a cab, like that was my first thought. Do you guys have anything you would like to add to that?
You guys are in California are on the cutting edge of this sort of stuff, because I feel like the Ubers of the world, that was, at least until they have been getting more and more regulated out there. That was their starting point for this sort of stuff. I could say Pennsylvania, where I am, is very much in the infancy as far as the law goes. A vehicle like that would be allowed to be tested on Pennsylvania roads. We don't have a full-fledged body of laws governing autonomous vehicles yet. But you have to have a licensed driver behind the wheel, or I guess in this case, the joystick. So I'm assuming that droids would be considered an autonomous vehicle as opposed to a sentient life form controlling that land speeder. So you can test here, but at the end of the day, that driver has to be there, and that's going to be the one that assumes legal liability. And there's all these reporting requirements in Pennsylvania if there's accidents and whatnot. The Pennsylvania Department of Transportation is taking a very close look at this stuff before more legislation is enacted.
And do they follow the 3 laws of robotics? Like, how's this all going to work out if there's, they have to make a decision of, do I brake or not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When the Mandalorian clearly doesn't have a high regard for droids for some reason or another.
And I think we'll find out why, because we got the beginning of a flashback, so foreshadowing. Gabby, any thoughts on the autonomous vehicle?
No, I was
issue?
just going to say, here where I am in Connecticut, we're even further behind. All we have right now is a task force, but our governor did recently announce a 2030 transportation plan. So that may be on the list of things to do, is self-driving public transportation. So we'll see.
Yeah, I happen to live where those companies are headquarters, and this is like being tested, so that's why I'll see them. Be very hard not to. Even though Uber's gotten into other trouble this week with the comment from their CEO saying nice things about Saudi Arabia murdering a reporter, but we'll see if that plays out even more, because that's just not okay. We have wonderful issues after the client retains the Mandalorian with a down payment, and with a shoulder guard being made from the metal from the Great Purge. We have these questions that don't have answers yet of, what is a foundling? Who are their guardians? And I don't know where we're going to get that. Thomas, you're the trivia champion. Have you ever seen any of that in any canonical material?
No, and I will confess my knowledge of the EU and the sort of rich Mandalorian backstory that was kind of crafted in there, and Filoni and Favreau may be drawing from is preciously limited. We've seen a great deal about the Mandalorians in the Clone Wars and Rebels, but not quite this sort of backstory. I will say, I wonder whether the terms of their deal, they kind of hastily worked out an oral contract there, but if the Mandalorian failed to bring back that bounty and somehow survived, would he just have to, I'm assuming that down payment is returnable, refundable. Is he going to have to give back that pauldron and go back to the Mandalorian foundry and collect up the rest of it to give back? I'm not quite sure how that would work. I assume the client would just kill him and be done with it. But
I actually think, well, let's do this now. Okay, we're going to get into some serious spoilers, even though you probably have guessed that. I think there's a good argument that the contract with the client is unenforceable on public policy grounds, because a bounty hunter is going after someone who's jumped bail. How the hell does an infant jump bail?
right.
You cannot have an infant have a kill order put out on said infant, because that's now murder from hire. It's not bringing somebody in for skipping bail. So that would violate all the tenets that would go into a contract to bring somebody in because for an infraction of some kind. So finding out that this isn't about bringing in the child, excuse me, the infant, but IG-11 was ordered to terminate said infant. That's no murder for hire, and which is clearly out of scope for a bounty hunter to be sent to kill a kid. So I think that would make the contract unenforceable. Thus, the Mandalorian would not need to return the down payment because of the public policy concerns with having a hit put out on an infant.
I think there's some serious misrepresentation on the part of the client, and to that extent, the Mandalorian didn't have a full appreciation for what he was contracting for, which would go straight to your point. Because when he's told that the target is 50 years old, he obviously, based on his reaction when he sees the baby, is thinking a 50-year-old, human or normal alien, and he is clearly taken off, caught off guard when he sees this baby. And IG-11 is like different species age at a different rate. And so I think he clearly didn't anticipate that sort of thing. And I don't know whether that's within the parameters of the Bounty Hunters Guild and their protocol waiver, if that's an allowable thing to put a contract out on a child. It seems to give him pause, and whether that's pause because it's outside the bounds of what's allowable by law or his own personal code, I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw a bit of a wrench or play devil's advocate, because
Baby killer.
no, because
wanted little Yoda dead, didn't you?
I want like my own stuffed little baby Yoda, because he's just like so cute, and that's going to be Star Wars' next major like product.
That's right.
But anyway,
Christmas shopping has begun. So.
So Josh, going back to your, throwback to first year contracts, I think when the Mandalorian was contracted to go obtain this target, I think this is a contract that's outside of the kind of his role or scope of employment, or whatever you would refer to it as a bounty hunter, right? He's doing this kind of in simple terms of, I will pay you X to go find to go find and bring back my dog, right? So I think those are kind of the simple contract terms. I mean, obviously it's not a dog, but we don't know what relation the target is to, the individual he contracts with. So, and there's also the issue that the Mandalorian's contract has been bring the target in alive for the full contract price, or dead for a lesser amount of the contract price. IG-11 may have been contracted by somebody else who did put a hit on the target. So that, because he said my orders are to kill, so whereas we know from the conversation that the Mandalorian had was that his orders were either to bring in for full price, bring in alive for full price, or bring in cold for half the price. So I think the contract is still enforceable. And I think, we don't know what he's going to do. I mean, all we saw, the closing shot was the whole ET image. So I don't think we know what he's kind of going to do with the target now that he has him alive. He clearly took out his competition. So there may be some violation of the bounty hunter code there. But I think that the contract is still enforceable, and I think it has nothing to do with the scope of bounty hunting rules and whether or not the target was a bounty or not a bounty, because it was something that was done outside of the scope of his role as a bounty hunter. It was a simple kind of transaction as opposed to a bounty transaction with grief.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because grief specifically sends him like, look, this is not within my realm. You've got to go. I know of some work for you, but this is not a guild job.
Yeah.
Which makes him more like a PI.
Mm-hmm.
And, and a public, investigator is not a hitman. And when I agree with you, and Thomas raised this last night when we called to to gush and and be very emotional about the Mandalorian. Another party could have hired IG-11. That there could be.
That was a really good point.
Yeah, and I like the fact both of you reached that. Very smart. I think that makes perfect sense. That another party wanted the infant dead, and you send an assassin droid that doesn't have the moral qualms about killing an infant. That conceptually makes sense. And the Mandalorian did want to take the infant in. And like the IG-11 and the Mandalorian didn't confer if they had the same client, which could be very interesting as well.
Well, and here's a question. I had a question for you two on that point. They show up roughly the same time. Is there any order of precedence as to whether either of them has a greater right to that bounty?
I don't think so, because neither performed their contract. And looking on Wikipedia at the Bounty Hunter Code, you're not supposed to kill other bounty hunters, so there's that. The code also says capture by design, kill if necessary. So that hints at killing's not the first order of business. Also, no bounty is worth dying for. Let's see now. No hunter shall slay another hunter. So we can break that down. No hunter shall interfere with another's hunt. Well, they both got there at roughly the same time to begin their assault. If you call it a tie, and that gets into them negotiating, how do we handle this of let's share and split it? That raises all kinds of wonderful issues of, can you have a contract with a droid? Is IG-11 a person? And was that oral contract made during a shootout enforceable? Because would the shootout count as duress? Because, well, they weren't shooting at each other, they were getting shot at. And there were some terms that were not agreed to expressly. So again, a trip down memory lane for contracts. Again, let's use California law, because that's what I pulled up. All persons are capable of contracting except minors, persons of a sound mind, and persons deprived of civil rights. Okay, so are we going to call IG-11 a person? Did a blog post on this. If IG-11 understands the meaning of the contractual terms, I say he could be able to contract, that he meets all the legal requirements. We don't have to discuss whether or not a robot's life, but contractually speaking, he can have a mutual understanding of what needs to be done. And that mutual understanding was, we go get the mark and we split the profits. The undefined terms of, we're getting the reputation credit. And I think there was one other thing. It was split the reward and get the reputation credits. The Mandalorian doesn't agree to the reputation credits, and IG-11 wanted an answer on that.
And then he gets shot. I want to see more. I think our opinion is going to shift on this probably as the season plays out, assuming IG-11 is put back together, which he had better be, and continue his role, because Taika Waititi, the voice actor that plays him, has described him as sort of having this like childlike mind, and so that goes directly to one of those core contracting capacity provisions, Josh, that you raised, which is, can you approximate his programming? Can you, I don't think you're going to base a capacity based on the age of the machine. So, how do you determine that? Is he just automatically capable just because he's been programmed? Because he clearly has some gaps in his understanding of how the world works.
That interview was done when we haven't seen all the episodes yet.
Yeah.
So if basically IG-11 just got a frontal lobotomy that that the Mandalorian puts him back together, that he's only mostly dead because he's a robot, and we'll rebuild him and put him back together. If that diminishes his capacity, maybe he won't be able to have enter agreements anymore. But I think the first time that we saw him, I think he did qualify for being able to understand the terms of an agreement and what needed to be done. His citing subchapter 16, I think it might be very linear, it might be very blunt, but he definitely understood the terms of said contract.
So I'm gonna challenge you, because I think he kind of does have a more limited capacity, not in the way that we traditionally think about it as somebody being kind of more diminished capacity. But I think, you know, we were talking about earlier, why would somebody hire, if there is kind of two hires or two kind of hit orders put out on this target, why would somebody hire IG-11 as opposed to a bounty hunter? You know, getting a skilled bounty hunter to obtain this target. And I think the thing is if the order was for a kill order, you're going to want a droid that doesn't kind of have the emotional capacity to consider, oh my God, this is a baby, like maybe I shouldn't shoot it, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So you would want somebody that doesn't have that emotional conflict. The other thing is that he seems to he knows the protocol, or the subparagraph of subparagraph 16, which could be something that was programmed into him to kind of iterate as he's kind of going in, like, you know, kind of a knock and announce protocol. And then the only real free will, if you want to call it that he seems to have, is, you know, he can converse with the Mandalorian, but the only decision-making power he seems to have is to kind of temporarily stop the self-destruct protocol, right? Because it's not something that goes off automatically. He continually kind of shuts it down as the Mandalorian yells at him, and then it comes back, and then he finally shuts it down completely. So I would say that you know, and it would be interesting to see if he comes back, if it's an even more limited. But I would challenge you on the idea of what kind of abilities he can conceptualize, and what things he can conceptualize and what things he can actually decide for himself, as opposed to something being inherent in his programming.
I think we saw problem-solving skills, such as both looking at the blaster cannon, and again, beautiful visual storytelling and the right way to work in humor. Again, I just want to go hug Bavaro. And also, I think deciding not to use the thermal detonator in his chest for the self-destruct protocol because it's a warranty of we won't get captured. I think that was using free will. Because he didn't say, like, no, we're going to get captured, so I got to, you know, end this right now. Again, I also think that was probably the most effective humor in the entire episode, was the two of them interacting about don't blow yourself up, which kind of brings back memories of Dark Star, which was another mid-1970s, very esoteric sci-fi. That aside, we'll see. I would hate for them to knock out IG-11. I mean, I got the bobblehead. The Black Series is coming out. It's just a horrible tease. Even though we got to see him do stuff that IG-88 never did on camera, except for animation. So